Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Dana's Game Reviews, or DGR for short. The topic for this week, the discussion for this week, is going to be related to Breath of the Wild. Even though the game is almost 2 years old, it is still very prevalent and relevant in the gaming industry. Breath of the Wild is, hands down, unquestionably one of the greatest video games of all time. Yet, I have periodically seen some fans say that Breath of the Wild is not a quote-unquote real Zelda game. Oftentimes this has to do with the fact that they cite that Breath of the Wild doesn't follow the traditional Zelda structure that we've become accustomed to in the past 3D Zelda games, such as it doesn't follow you'll go into a dungeon, you'll get an item halfway through that dungeon, and then you go through the rest of the dungeon and defeat the boss, or the fact that it doesn't follow the 3 dungeon formula, or in which you go through 3 dungeons, you get the Master Sword, all heck breaks loose because Ganondorf shows his true self or takes over the world, or Zant shows his true self, and then you complete 5 to 7 dungeons and fight the final boss. It doesn't have the same story structure that past Zelda games are known for having, and personally, I highly disagree with this idea that Breath of the Wild isn't a real Zelda game. I want to make it perfectly abundantly clear that I absolutely love and adore all of the Zelda games. And also, I think it's okay and frankly good for Zelda games to be different from one another, because the Zelda fanbase is a very diverse group of people that like Zelda for different reasons. Some people love Zelda for its story, its lore, and its characters. Some people love Zelda for its gameplay. Some people love Zelda because they love the dungeons, they love the puzzle solving, they love fighting the bosses, they love collecting items. Other people love Zelda because of, they love the pure exploration and adventure. And frankly, I can be put into all of those categories because I love all those aspects of Zelda. And in fact, I love different Zelda games for different reasons. In fact, my 2 favorite Zelda games, and frankly my 2 favorite games of all time, almost couldn't be more different from one another in some ways. Those 2 games being Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild. Ocarina of Time is a very tightly crafted, expertly crafted game with, a very sort of tightly knit, perfectly pitch-perfect flow to its story and its expertly crafted dungeons with brilliant themes of forest, fire, water, shadow, and spirit, and a truly epic ending. Whereas Breath of the Wild is a game all about adventure and exploration. It's all about you being alone in this world of Hyrule and exploring the world of Hyrule at your own whim. Now, I want to get into the arguments and why I think that looking at Breath of the Wild through the sense of it's not a Zelda game because it doesn't follow the traditional Zelda structure / Zelda formula, Zelda progression, I think it's a pretty shallow way of looking at things, to be perfectly honest, because to a layman, whether or not a Zelda game is a Zelda game would seem pretty straightforward. Is it a game that's made and produced by Nintendo? Is it a game that takes place within the official Zelda canon and chronology? Does it have Link, Zelda, the Triforce, and Ganon/Ganondorf? If yes, then yeah, it's a Zelda game. Obviously, I don't count games like Hyrule Warriors, although it's a fun game. I don't count it as a real Zelda game. It's very obviously a spin-off game that just so happens to have a Zelda backdrop. But back to Breath of the Wild. The fact is, Breath of the Wild, Nintendo said it right off the bat that it was going to change the conventions of the Zelda series. So, of course, it would have been logical to assume that it was going to be radically different from all past Zelda games. As well as the fact that I find it a little bit ironic that, obviously, they're not all the same people saying this, and a lot of people complained about the Zelda formula and how it was getting too repetitive, especially with games like Skyward Sword. I mean, I love Skyward Sword. I thought it had amazing storyline and some of the best dungeons and boss fights in the series. But a lot of people didn't like it because, admittedly, it was very linear compared to most Zelda games, really any Zelda game leading up to it, and it was very bound in terms of what you could do and where you could go. The game heavily regulated your behavior in the game, really it was you had to like go from point A, B to C in the story progression, which for the game I think worked fine, but it definitely wasn't the Zelda game that people at the time wanted. And I want to make it clear that it's not most of the fan base that's, saying that Breath of the Wild isn't a real Zelda game, but it's just the arguments that I'm hearing that I just feel like I want to address. So Nintendo said right off the bat that they were going to go back to the original sort of Zelda preference, as in Zelda on the NES. And if you really think about it, the very first Zelda game on the Nintendo Entertainment System really was the first real open-world video game ever made. Like, we think of games like Skyrim or The Witcher, like, that all stems from games like, well, the very, very first Legend of Zelda game, in terms of being a very boundless, very open game. You could essentially, right from the moment you start the game, go anywhere you want. You can even theoretically go to the final, beat the game without even using the sword, which Nintendo Capri Sun demonstrated in his Let's Play of the game several years ago. In Breath of the Wild, in many ways, almost feels, and I know some people might disagree with this, it almost feels like the true, like, real spiritual sequel to the first Zelda game, in terms of being the first Zelda game since really the first game on the NES to really have that sort of open world, open air feel where you could really go just about anywhere you want, do pretty much anything you want. Really, after the tutorial, which in and of itself is already very open, the world's your oyster. Like, it's pure exploration and pure adventure from the outset. And even between the two games, there's a lot of visual similarities, visual motifs. The idea of Hyrule sort of being a broken, ruined kingdom, a shadow of its former glory. You start out both games by either entering a cave or leaving a cave, and talking/meeting an old man, and being given the directive that you have to save/assist Zelda. You're sort of just thrown into this open world with little knowledge. Even visually speaking, there's a lot of similarities. Like I believe I stated previously, like there's a lot of like mountains, there's a lot of like forest in both games, a lot of lakes, a lot of rivers, a lot of visual similarities between the two games. And if anything, if I were to look at it from a purist perspective, I'd almost say that, like, because of that, Breath of the Wild is even more of a Zelda game than most Zelda games. And by the way, I don't really like the idea of there being a pure or right way to make a Zelda game, because like I said, one of the great things about Zelda games is they all have their own unique flavor to them, and I love them all for different reasons. Like, I love games like Ocarina of Time because of how it's all about growing up, and, really, for me, sort of what it's like to be a child and then have to be an adult, and the kind of responsibilities that come with it, as well as just the wonderful music and level design. I love Wind Waker for its whimsical feel and having this massive ocean with several little islands that you can explore, as well as having arguably the best interpretation of Ganondorf in the entire series. Love Twilight Princess for having arguably the best dungeons in the entire series and best sidekick series. I love Skyward Sword for having probably the best story/narrative of any Zelda game and having one of the best villains of any Zelda game. And I love Breath of the Wild, obviously, for sheer boundless exploration and adventure. And frankly, that's just an example of how diverse the Zelda series is and how it's reflected in the fan base. But that still doesn't make any of them any less of a Zelda game, and especially not Breath of the Wild. Due to the fact that, as I said, Breath of the Wild borrows heavily from the very first Zelda game. And obviously the very first Zelda game is far, far from the best Zelda game. Like, unquestionably, the Zelda games got much, much better after the first one. Better dungeons design, like, better stories, more interesting characters, better boss battles. But there's also no question that they also got much more progressively linear with each installment, really culminating in Skyward Sword. Link Between Worlds broke away from that somewhat. It was sort of a middle of the road sort of game between the sort of a bridge between like the Zelda style we were used to and what was going to come next in the form of Breath of the Wild. But there's no question that the games did get much more linear after the first Zelda game, and it's almost as though Nintendo said, like, theoretically, if we had never made a Zelda game before after the first Zelda game, what would that be? Like, theoretically, and Breath of the Wild, I feel like very much is sort of that answer. And yeah, I feel like Breath of the Wild is not only is it a Zelda game, it's as much a Zelda game as any Zelda game has ever been. And Breath of the Wild still has the things that make Zelda Zelda. It still has puzzle solving. It still has, items. It still has the Master Sword and the Triforce and things like that. And it still has, of course, Zelda and Hyrule and all these great things that make Zelda Zelda. It does some of these things in a much more subdued way, which I think was deliberate. And it's exactly the Zelda game we needed at the time we needed it. And frankly, I couldn't be happier with the game we got. I can't wait to see where Zelda goes from here. Obviously, the dungeons in Breath of the Wild, compared to many of the 3D Zelda games, definitely felt somewhat underwhelming. But frankly, in terms of like how good the game is in every other aspect, that almost doesn't feel like a big deal to me, honestly. Especially since it deliberately needed to break the formula. And by the way, having a formula isn't a bad thing. Most popular franchises have, formulas, whether it be Super Mario or Castlevania, or don't even get me started on Call of Duty or most first-person shooting games. But, like, in the Zelda formula worked for a very long time, and, like, I've loved every Zelda game I've played. But there's no question that in 2017, like, we needed something more. Like, obviously they could have followed the formula and we still could have gotten a great game from it, but like it wouldn't have really been progressing or evolving the series. Breath of the Wild absolutely did do that. It was the Zelda of the 21st century. And it ended up being hands down one of the greatest games of all time. So that's all I really wanted to say about this subject, sort of my opinion, and I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you think of the new formula put in place by Breath of the Wild? Would you like to see Nintendo continue what they have with Breath of the Wild? Do you prefer the older 3D Zelda game formula? Would you like to see a marriage between the two formulas? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. And I can't wait to talk more about Zelda in my next video. If you're new to my channel, hope you subscribe. If you love the Legend of Zelda series as much as I do, I think you'll love what I have to talk about. And I'd love to hear from you guys as well. And I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you guys on the other side, and may the Triforce be with you. Ba 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 ba!
Welcome! Punch!
Thank you for watching. Subscribe!